The Mongol administrator checked his ledger one final time before the screaming started. His quill scratched across parchment, marking another name, Fatima al-Rashid. Age, 14. Status, pending. The ink hadn't even dried when boots thundered across stone outside. La takuduha, Hayatifla. Not her. She's only a child. The mother's wails cut through the morning air as soldiers pushed through the door. They moved with practiced efficiency, past the overturned water jug, past the scattered prayer beads. The girl pressed herself against the wall, dark eyes wide with terror her mother had tried so hard to prevent. The administrator didn't look up. His finger traced down the list, finding her entry among hundreds catalogued weeks before the siege even began. Height, suitable. Lineage, notable. Fertility indicators, promising. Another scratch of the quill. Status, processed. The mother lunged forward, and that's when she saw it. The ledger. Her daughter's name already there, already decided. The horror that crossed her face wasn't about the soldiers anymore. It was the realization that this moment had been planned before the first arrow flew, before the walls crumbled, before her husband died defending the gates. Outside, similar scenes unfolded in perfect synchronization. Doors kicked open, names called out. Girls dragged toward the administrative tents where breeding assignments were distributed with the same efficiency as grain rations. The quill kept moving. Another name, another scratch, another future catalogued in ink and suffering. How did one empire transform systematic rape into the largest genetic conquest in human history? Why do 16 million men today carry DNA evidence of industrialized sexual violence that happened 8 centuries ago? To understand how the Mongols turned women's bodies into tools of permanent colonization and why their descendants walk among you right now, we need to rewind through the most horrific breeding program ever documented. The evidence lies waiting in administrative ledgers written in the blood of millions. The lab technician stared at the DNA report and checked it 3 times. This couldn't be right. Marcus Chen had ordered the test as a birthday gift to himself. One of those ancestry kits advertised on podcasts. Spit in a tube, mail it off, discover you're 3% Viking or whatever. Standard stuff. But his results showed something that made the technician request a second sample. The genetic marker was unmistakable. Y-chromosome lineage CM217, star cluster variation, direct patrilineal descent from Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan. Here's where it gets systematic. Marcus wasn't special. He was one of 16 million living men who carry this exact genetic signature. 16 million. Let that number sink in. That's more than the entire population of Cambodia. More than every person in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Houston combined. All descended from one man who died 8 centuries ago. The sound of fingers typing on a keyboard filled the genetics lab as Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus, pulled up the statistical models. She'd been studying this phenomenon for 15 years, and the math still made her sick. For one man to have 16 million living descendants through natural reproduction would be mathematically impossible. Even if he had 100 willing wives and perfect fertility, the numbers don't work. The computer models were clear. To achieve this level of genetic penetration required something else entirely. She clicked through to the next slide in her presentation. The one she'd never shown at conferences. The one that revealed what those 16 million men really represented. But the geneticist discovered something that made her hands shake. Each carrier didn't just represent one violation. The branching patterns in the DNA told a different story. For every man alive today with this marker, hundreds of women had been systematically raped in his ancestral line. The genetic evidence showed repeated, organized patterns of assault across generations. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she traced the data with her finger. Here, a cluster in Central Asia, where the marker appeared in 90% of one village's male population. There, a line through Eastern Europe, where it followed old trade routes with terrifying precision. Each data point represented not just genetic material, but orchestrated violence on a scale that defied comprehension. Marcus Chen's email popped up on her screen. Is this for real? Am I really related to Genghis Khan? This is so cool. She stared at his message for a long moment. How do you explain to someone that their cool ancestry result is actually evidence of history's largest systematic rape campaign? That the genetic marker they carry is a 800-year-old scar written in DNA? The numbers revealed a truth too horrible for the published study. Academic papers talked about reproductive success and genetic legacy, clean, sanitized terms that obscured the reality. But Dr. Chen had done the calculations that others avoided. If 16 million men alive today carry this marker, and if each represents hundreds of violated women in their lineage, then the Mongol expansion had turned reproductive violence into something unprecedented. She pulled up another file, this one from a colleague in Mongolia who'd been analyzing burial sites. The mass graves of young women, all showing signs of repeated trauma, all from the same period. The archaeological evidence matched the genetic patterns perfectly. Her phone buzzed. Another ancestry result, another excited customer discovering their connection to the Great Khan. This one from a teacher in Ohio, thrilled to have such interesting heritage to share with his students. What they found next in the genetic patterns changed everything. The marker didn't spread randomly. It followed administrative districts, appearing in clusters that matched old Mongol taxation records. The genetic map looked exactly like a bureaucratic org chart, as if rape had been assigned by postal code. Dr. Chen opened her desk drawer and pulled out a photocopy she'd received from a researcher in Iran, a fragment of an old ledger, translated from Persian. Names, ages, assignments. The handwriting was precise, businesslike. Each entry included notes about fertility indicators, family lineage, physical characteristics. The systematic nature of it made her close her eyes. This wasn't the chaos of war. This was infrastructure. She thought about Marcus Chen and his birthday surprise, about the 16 million men walking around with this genetic evidence embedded in every cell of their bodies. Living, breathing proof of an industrialized horror that most history books reduce to a footnote about Mongol brutality. The lab equipment hummed its familiar tune. But tonight, it sounded like an accusation. Every test they ran, every marker they identified, they were documenting crimes that could never be prosecuted, suffering that had been literally bred into the human genome. But to understand how 16 million men became unwitting evidence of history's greatest sexual crime, we have to examine the intelligence networks that started cataloguing women before the Mongols even arrived at the city walls. The spy walked through Damascus markets in 1218, but he wasn't looking at goods. He was shopping for women who didn't know they were for sale. His handler had given him specific instructions. Age range, 12 to 20. Physical markers, clear skin, wide hips, straight teeth. Family history. How many children did their mothers birth? How many survived? The questions seemed like idle merchant gossip, but each answer went into mental ledgers more precise than any trade manifest. The sound of haggling covered his real work. While vendors shouted prices for silk and saffron, he counted daughters, that spice merchant's girl helping with scales, the water carrier's sister drawing from the well, the scribe's twin daughters learning letters in the corner shop, all of them catalogued, categorized, numbered. He wasn't alone. The whispered reports came in from every quarter of the city. Other men, posing as traders, pilgrims, scholars. They moved through bathhouses, where women gossiped about their families. They befriended midwives who knew which bloodlines produced the most children. They paid servants to describe the young women hidden behind courtyard walls. The network extended far beyond Damascus. Similar operations unfolded in Baghdad, Bukhara, Samarkand. Cities that hadn't even heard the Mongol name yet. Cities that thought their walls meant safety. Here's where the intelligence gathering turned methodical. The spies didn't just note beauty. They tracked menstrual cycles through bathhouse gossip. They recorded which families had histories of twins. They identified girls who'd shown early fertility by helping raise numerous younger siblings. The data points accumulated like drops of poison in a well. The handler met his spies in a dried fruit warehouse after sunset. The scratching of quills on parchment mixed with the rustle of apricots being sorted. Names, ages, addresses. Family trees extending back 3 generations. Maps showing which neighborhoods held the highest concentrations of suitable candidates. They used a ranking system, 3 marks for exceptional beauty, 2 for proven family fertility, 1 for age within optimal range. Bonus marks for prestigious bloodlines that would provide genetic diversity to the Mongol stock. The mathematics of human livestock, calculated while the unsuspecting city slept. But the most chilling part wasn't the lists themselves. It was the timing. The spy in Damascus finished his work in 1218. The Mongols wouldn't arrive until 1220. 2 years. 2 years of normal life for girls who'd already been marked. 2 years of first loves, marriage negotiations, dreams about the future, all while their names sat in ledgers, waiting. The intelligence network operated like this across the entire Persian world. Spies who spent years embedded in communities, building trust, attending weddings, celebrating births, all while secretly updating their catalogues of breeding stock. A merchant's wife in Isfahan mentioned her daughter's first blood to a friendly cloth seller. That information travelled through hidden channels to administrators 1,000 miles away. A proud grandfather in Herat boasted about his family's tradition of bearing sons. His granddaughters' names went on a special list. The coins changed hands in darkness. Local informants, often deeply in debt, sold information about their own neighbours. Which families kept their daughters most sheltered, indicating virginity. Which bloodlines had resisted previous invaders, suggesting genetic strength worth preserving. Which girls had caught the eye of local nobles, marking them as prize specimens. They even tracked the Jewish and Christian communities separately. Different breeding programs for different populations. The administrators understood genetic diversity centuries before the science existed to name it. The sound of footsteps on cobblestones marked another spy returning with updates. This one had infiltrated the governor's household. The official's 3 daughters, aged 15, 13, and 11. All healthy, all beautiful. Their mother had birthed 8 children total, prime candidates. The spy didn't feel guilt as he made his notes. These weren't people to him anymore. They were entries in a breeding inventory that would soon be activated. The same detachment a farmer feels counting cattle. Meanwhile, the women of Damascus went about their lives. The spice merchant's daughter dreamed of marrying the baker's son. The water carrier's sister practiced her embroidery for a dowry that would never matter. The scribe's twins composed poetry they'd never finish. None of them knew that men had been watching them for months, evaluating their hips as they walked, listening to their laughter to judge their temperament, assessing their value not as humans but as breeding vessels. The network extended into the very structure of society. Midwives reported on family fertilities. Bathhouse attendants tracked monthly cycles. Even matchmakers unknowingly contributed data as they discussed bloodlines and family histories. The entire social fabric had been infiltrated by an intelligence operation focused on a single goal: identifying the most efficient rape targets. When the handler compiled his final report for Damascus, it contained over 3,000 names. 3,000 girls and women, sorted by neighborhood, ranked by breeding potential, cross-referenced with family trees. The document would travel east in coded caravans, reaching Mongol administrators who'd never seen Damascus, but already knew exactly which doors their soldiers would knock down. The warehouses fell silent as the spies finished their work. Tomorrow, they'd leave the city, their merchant covers intact. The families they'd befriended would wonder why their trading partner had departed so suddenly. By the time they understood, it would be too late. Some spies left behind more than just intelligence. They'd identified which local men could be turned into collaborators when the time came. Men who would trade their neighbors' daughters for their own family's safety. The infrastructure of betrayal, carefully cultivated over years of patient work. The scrolls travelled east in hidden compartments, each name a future tragedy, each ranking a countdown to horror, the most efficient intelligence network of its time, dedicated entirely to sexual slavery. But these weren't random battlefield atrocities. The evidence proved something far worse. The Mongols had turned rape into an administrative science, and the bureaucrats waiting to process those carefully gathered names had developed systems that would make modern human traffickers look like amateurs. The administrator's quill scratched across parchment with mechanical precision. Another column, another entry, another woman reduced to numbers. In Bukhara, 1221. The breeding ledgers filled an entire room. Shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, each one documenting human beings like grain shipments. The smell of ink mixed with the musk of old paper. Outside, women screamed as soldiers dragged them to processing tents. Inside, the administrator simply turned to a fresh page. The columns told their own story of systematic horror. Name, age, processing date, fertility assessment, assignment location, current pregnancy status, offspring count. The bureaucratic language stripped away humanity with surgical efficiency. Here's where it gets systematic. The actual ledger from 1221 still exists, preserved in a private collection in Russia. When historians finally gained access in 1992, they couldn't believe what they were reading. The entry for one girl, Yasmin of Merv, age 15, included notations that would make modern data analysts proud. Height in cubits, weight estimates, family fertility history going back 3 generations. Even notes about her temperament during initial processing. The administrator had rated her compliance on a scale of 1 to 5. But the most chilling detail was the timestamp. Her processing was recorded at exactly 2 hours after sunrise, 3rd day of the month. The next entry, Fatima of Nishapur, was logged 6 minutes later, then Zara, then Amina. The industrial efficiency of horror, measured in 6-minute intervals. The ledgers revealed breeding quotas that regional administrators had to meet. Each district was assigned monthly targets based on population estimates from those intelligence reports. 30 pregnancies per month for a mid-sized city, 50 for larger urban centers, bonuses for exceeding quotas, punishments for falling short. An administrator in Herat received a commendation for achieving 130% of his quarterly target. His reward? First pick of the next shipment of women. The economics of rape, documented in careful script. The scratching of quills never stopped. Day and night, administrators recorded outcomes with the same detachment they'd use for horse breeding. Subject 1243 delivered male offspring, healthy. Assigned to military training cohort 7. The babies had numbers before they had names. The efficiency metrics painted an even darker picture. Administrators tracked processing time, how quickly they could move women from capture to first rape. They competed to reduce these times, sharing best practices across the empire. One ledger contained a proud note about reducing average processing time from 3 days to 36 hours. Pages rustled as the administrator in Bukhara cross-referenced his lists. Some women appeared in multiple ledgers, traded between districts like commodities. A girl taken in Damascus might appear in Baghdad's records 6 months later, then in Samarkand's after that. The empire-wide tracking system followed them wherever they were sent. The punishment records occupied their own special section. Women who resisted faced escalating consequences, all carefully documented. First offense, food reduction. Second offense, isolation. Third offense, assignment to the military brothels, the worst fate of all. Each punishment included dates, durations, and outcomes. The bureaucracy of breaking human spirits. But the administrators tracked something else that reveals the true industrial scale of this horror. Pregnancy failure rates, miscarriages, stillbirths. Women who couldn't conceive fast enough. The ledgers contained a column marked non-productive status, with chilling subcategories. The sound of abacus beads clicking accompanied the monthly reports. Regional breeding statistics rolled up to Central Command. Administrators who managed thousands of women reduced their suffering to percentages and trend lines. 72% pregnancy rate this quarter, up 3% from last period. Stillbirth rate holding steady at 18%. One preserved document from 1222 showed the empire-wide totals. Over 40,000 women in the breeding system, 8,000 confirmed pregnancies that quarter. Approximately 6,000 live births expected. The numbers were annotated with suggestions for improving efficiency. The genetic sorting started immediately after birth. Male infants with superior characteristics went to military training programs. Females were categorized as future breeding stock or domestic servants based on their mother's performance. The ledgers tracked these children through identification marks burned into their shoulders. Here's where the documentation reveals something that modern historians struggle to believe. The administrators tracked genetic outcomes across generations. They noted which bloodline combinations produced the strongest warriors, which pairings resulted in the most fertile daughters. They were conducting selective breeding experiments on a massive scale, centuries before anyone understood genetics. The quill paused over one entry: a woman who'd given birth to 6 sons, all surviving to adulthood. The administrator made a special notation: exceptional producer, prioritized nutrition, assigned to senior officers only. Even in this system, some women were valued more than others, though only as premium livestock. The breeding ledgers also contained death records: women who died in childbirth, those who took their own lives, those who simply stopped eating and wasted away. Each death was recorded with the same bureaucratic indifference: asset loss, replacement required. But look closer at the suicide records and a pattern emerges: spikes after mass child removals. When administrators took babies from their mothers, death rates tripled. The ledgers noted this correlation without emotion. Just another data point to consider in optimizing the system. The administrator in Bukhara finished his daily report as the sun set. 312 women processed this week, 47 confirmed pregnancies, 12 births, 8 surviving, 6 deaths, 2 by suicide, 4 in childbirth. He sealed the report with wax and handed it to the courier. Tomorrow he'd open a fresh ledger and continue the work. More columns, more numbers, more lives reduced to entries in the empire's breeding machinery. The banality of administrative evil, documented one scratched entry at a time. The courier carried the reports along the same roads that transported the women themselves. Which brings us to the mobile breeding facilities that followed the armies. What archaeologists found at caravan sites defies belief. The Mongols hadn't just systematized rape in conquered cities, they'd made it portable. The caravan stretched for 3 miles, but the covered wagons in the center weren't carrying supplies. The sounds coming from inside were human. The wheels creaked under loads they weren't designed for. Canvas covers pulled tight to muffle what happened within. Guards rode in precise formations, not watching for bandits but for escape attempts from their own convoy. The dust cloud rising from this procession marked something far worse than any merchant train. A Mongol administrator rode alongside, ledger balanced on his saddle horn. Every 6 hours he'd stop to update entries. Wagon 4, 12 occupants, 3 pregnant, 1 death in transit. Wagon 7, 15 occupants, 5 past optimal breeding age, recommend redistribution at next garrison. The scratching of his quill competed with muffled sobs drifting through canvas walls. Here's what made these mobile units unique. They weren't temporary measures during city sieges. Archaeological evidence from caravan sites across Central Asia reveals permanent infrastructure. Stone foundations for medical tents, latrine systems designed for long-term camps, mass burial sites with remains showing specific patterns of trauma. The Mongols had created moving cities dedicated to systematic rape. The medical equipment found at these sites tells its own story. Birthing chairs, surgical tools, herbs known to prevent miscarriage. Even primitive pregnancy tests using wheat and barley, a technique they'd learned from Egyptian sources. This wasn't battlefield chaos. This was an organized medical operation focused on maximizing reproductive output. Inside Wagon 4, the women had stopped trying to comfort each other. The 16-year-old from Bukhara stared at nothing. The twins from Merv held hands in silence. The merchant's widow counted days since her last bleeding, knowing what a missed cycle meant in this rolling prison. The wooden floor beneath them was stained with evidence of those who'd come before. The administrator made another note. The pregnant ones would be transferred to stationary facilities before their 3rd trimester. Too risky to deliver while moving. Those who'd recently given birth would remain in the caravan. The army needed fresh wombs following behind the front lines. But the sounds told the real story. Not just crying or pleading. The rhythmic creaking of wagon wheels trying to mask other rhythms. The bark of orders in Mongolian. The silence that followed resistance. At night, when the caravan stopped, the sounds grew worse. Soldiers visiting the wagons in shifts, organized by rank and rotation schedules. The mobile system solved a logistics problem the administrators discussed in preserved correspondence. Cities might fall quickly, but properly breaking and breeding women took time. The mobile units allowed continuous processing, while armies moved to next targets. Women taken in one city could be pregnant by the time they reached the next siege. Efficient use of travel time, as one administrator proudly noted. The medical tent at the center of each caravan cluster marked where the true horror unfolded. Here, the Mongol physicians conducted examinations that went beyond basic health checks. They tested fertility through methods that would make modern doctors recoil. They experimented with herbs to increase conception rates. They performed procedures on women who resisted pregnancy, procedures the archaeological remains suggest few survived. A physician emerged from the medical tent, blood on his leather apron. He nodded to the administrator, who made another ledger entry. Subject 2043. Procedure completed, return to wagon 6. The woman who stumbled out behind him could barely walk. 2 guards half carried her back to her rolling prison. The caravan included specialized wagons historians initially mistook for supply storage. The preserved remains of one, discovered in Kazakhstan in 2003, revealed their true purpose. Smaller compartments, restraint systems, drainage channels in the floor. These were punishment wagons for women who resisted or tried to escape. The organization extended to the guards themselves. Not random soldiers, but specialized units trained in managing human cargo. They learned optimal feeding schedules to maintain fertility. They knew which pressure points induced compliance without damaging reproductive organs. They rotated women between wagons to prevent solidarity building among prisoners. Every detail designed to break spirits while preserving bodies. Here's where the evidence becomes almost unbearable. Children's remains at caravan sites. Not infants, but children aged 2 to 5. The mobile units kept young children with their mothers just long enough to ensure survival, then sent them to training facilities. The women had to watch their toddlers loaded onto separate wagons, knowing they'd never see them again. The administrator's ledger included a section for these separations. Child number 891. Male, approximately 3 years. Good physical condition. Assigned to Karakoram training facility. The mother's reaction was noted too. Extreme distress. Recommend increased surveillance. The bureaucracy of destroying maternal bonds. The feeding system reveals another layer of calculated cruelty. Pregnant women receive better rations, but only while pregnant. The moment they gave birth, food reduced to subsistence levels. The message was clear. Your value exists only in your womb. Some women learn to hide pregnancies as long as possible, trading morning sickness for extra bread. Water allocation followed similar logic. The wooden barrels strapped to wagon sides held specific amounts. Guards distributed water through a slot, measuring portions based on pregnancy status and compliance ratings. Women who caused trouble watched their water rations shrink in the desert heat. Biological warfare waged through thirst. The caravan stopped at predetermined stations. Not random camps, but established posts with fresh guards, medical supplies, and empty wagons to replace those filled with the dead. Local administrators waited with their ledgers, updating central records, reassigning women based on breeding performance. The infrastructure stretched across the entire empire. One preserved way station in modern Uzbekistan still shows the holding pen foundations. Stone walls arranged in a specific pattern, small cells surrounding a central courtyard, drainage systems indicating regular washing down. The archaeologists who excavated it initially thought they'd found an ancient livestock market. They weren't entirely wrong. The sounds of evening prayers drifted from the women's wagons, different languages mixing. Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Chinese. Women from different cultures united only in suffering. The guards allowed prayer. It kept them calmer, more compliant, easier to manage. The administrators had learned that small mercies prevented larger rebellions. But prayers couldn't mask other sounds. The newborn's cry from wagon 12, the death rattle from wagon 3, the struggle and sharp slap from wagon 7, each sound catalogued by guards trained to interpret their human cargo's condition through canvas walls. They knew which sounds meant pregnancy, which meant illness, which meant another body to remove at dawn. The mobility created its own torture. Women taken from desert cities found themselves in mountain passes. Those from fertile valleys crossed endless steppes. The psychological displacement compounded physical suffering. Even the sky looked wrong. No familiar stars to pray toward, no homeland dust in the air, just the endless creaking of wheels carrying them further from everything they'd known. The administrator finished his evening report as cooking fires flickered between wagons. 3 births today, 2 surviving. 4 deaths, 1 suicide by strangulation with torn clothing. 16 confirmed pregnancies. Steady progress toward quarterly quotas. He sealed the report and passed it to a courier who'd ride through the night to regional headquarters. The caravan would move again at dawn. 3 more weeks to the next major city. 3 more weeks of wheels grinding through dust, carrying their human cargo toward predetermined destinations. Some women would birth on the road, others would die. All would be recorded in ledgers with the same mechanical precision. The true efficiency of these mobile units becomes clear only when you see the numbers. 1 caravan could process 200 women while covering 500 miles. Multiply that by dozens of caravans following different army groups. The breeding program never stopped moving, never stopped producing, never stopped destroying lives in 6-minute intervals recorded by administrators who saw only quotas and logistics. The wheels creaked on through the night. Inside, women who'd been mothers, daughters, scholars, merchants, tried to sleep on wooden floors, sticky with fear, and worse. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, the day after that, until they either died, aged out of usefulness, or produced enough children to satisfy their captors' quotas. But first, the empire needed to fill these wagons, and the selection process they used to choose which women would board those rolling prisons will sicken you, because it wasn't random, it was methodical. The 12-year-old girl didn't know why the stranger at the well asked about her monthly bleeding. She'd find out 3 weeks later when the Mongols arrived. Her mother had sent her to fetch water at dawn, the safest time. The streets of Nishapur still slept. Only bakers and water carriers moved through morning shadows. The stranger looked like another merchant, his worn robes dusty from travel. His questions seemed like idle talk. "Such a helpful daughter," he said, watching her lower the bucket. "Your mother must be proud. How many brothers and sisters help with chores?" 7, she answered, not looking up. Mother had taught her not to engage with strange men, but this one seemed harmless, grandfatherly even. 7, your parents are blessed. And you're the eldest? She nodded, hauling up the full bucket. Water sloshed over the rim. My niece just had her first blood, he continued, voice casual as morning prayer. Her mother worries she's too young. When did yours begin? The question made her freeze. Such things weren't discussed with men. But he'd already turned away, examining dates at a nearby stall. Just an old merchant making conversation. She mumbled something about last winter and hurried home. The stranger didn't buy any dates. Instead, he found a quiet corner and pulled out a small ledger. Amina al-Rashidi, age 12. First blood winter 1219. 7 siblings, all surviving. Strong back observed, carrying full water vessels. No visible defects. 3 weeks later, when boots thundered through her family's courtyard, she recognized him. Not a merchant at all. He stood beside the Mongol administrator, pointing, her, the twin boys from the bakery, the scribe's 3 daughters, all names on his list, all selected weeks before the siege began. But here's where the selection process reveals its true horror. The administrators didn't just rely on advanced intelligence, they developed a system that would make modern human traffickers look like amateurs. The wooden platform stood in Nishapur's main square like a livestock auction block, which is exactly what it was. The administrator sat behind his portable desk, ledger open, quill ready. Guards arranged the women in lines. The sorting began. First cut. Age. Guards pulled girls forward, checking teeth like horses, counting rings of growth, feeling jaw development. Anyone under 11 went to a separate pen. They'd be held until ready. Anyone over 25 joined another group. Different purpose. Different fate. The sound of mothers screaming mixed with bureaucratic efficiency. Number 43. Approximately 14. Good teeth. Proceed to secondary inspection. The scribe recorded every detail: height, weight estimates, visible health indicators. Even the way they walked revealed information to trained eyes. Secondary inspection happened in tents. Female collaborators, women who'd traded cooperation for their own children's lives, conducted intimate examinations. They checked for pregnancy, disease, virgin status. Their findings, whispered to scribes, went into different columns. Different categories meant different destinations. The administrator never looked up from his ledger. Names became numbers. Numbers became categories. Categories became fate. Virgin, pristine condition, reserved for senior officers. Non-virgin, healthy, general military use. Pregnant, special handling required. Diseased, immediate disposal. Here's the systematic cruelty. Sisters were deliberately separated. The administrators had learned that women fought harder when defending family, so the pretty one went to officer wagons, the plain one to infantry camps. They'd never see each other again, but each would forever wonder about the other's fate. The physical examinations went beyond basic health. Administrators measured hip width, predicting birthing capacity. They examined breasts for development, estimating milk production. They even checked family resemblances, selecting for genetic traits they wanted to reproduce. The Mongols understood bloodline breeding centuries before modern genetics. A girl stumbled during her walk across the platform. The administrator made a note. Possible lameness. Downgrade to Category 3. Her fate changed with that single misstep. Instead of officer assignments, she'd go to punishment wagons. All because her legs shook with fear at the wrong moment. But the selection wasn't just physical. They tested temperament too. A guard would suddenly shout at a girl, watching her reaction. Too much cowering meant weakness. Too much defiance meant trouble. They wanted that perfect middle ground. Broken enough to comply, strong enough to survive multiple pregnancies. The beauty rankings created their own hierarchy of horror. Exceptional beauty meant personal assignment to generals or the Khan himself. Standard beauty went to officer corps. Plain features meant soldier barracks. The ugly ones. The administrators had special uses for them too. Practice for young soldiers, rewards for menial workers. Every woman had a purpose in this system. The collaborators whispered their assessments with dead eyes. This one's 3 months pregnant. Previous birth, based on hip spread. They'd learned to read bodies like maps, each stretch mark and scar telling stories that determined futures. Their own children watched from designated safety areas. The price of their mother's cooperation. A new sound cut through the square. Girls singing. The administrators had learned that testing voices revealed lung capacity, general health, emotional strength. Those who sang clearly despite tears showed resilience. They'd survived the wagons better. The ones whose voices cracked and broke went to different lines. The wooden platform bore stains no amount of washing removed. Blood from resistors, urine from terror, vomit from morning sickness discovered during inspection. Each stain represented a moment when someone's daughter became inventory. The administrators worked around these marks without pause. Here's what the selection records show that makes this even worse. They tracked family traits across generations. If a mother had birthed many sons, her daughters were prime selections. If a bloodline showed twins, those women got special marking. The administrators were conducting a massive genetic experiment, using rape as their laboratory. The scribes developed shorthand for common entries, a symbol for virgin, another for proven breeder, quick marks for various physical qualities. The ledgers filled with these hieroglyphs of horror, each one representing a full human life reduced to breeding potential. The rejection area told its own story. Women too old, too sick, too damaged for breeding still had uses. Some became camp servants. Others were given to lowest-ranking soldiers as practice. The worst fate? Assignment to the punishment units, where women who tried to escape were sent as examples to others. The platform emptied as sorted groups were led to different staging areas. The virgins went first, highest value merchandise, then the proven breeders, then the questionables. Each group's destination already determined, their futures written in ledger columns. A 13-year-old caught the administrator's special attention, not for beauty, but for her build. Wide hips on a young frame, clear skin despite poor nutrition. 6 female cousins in the intelligence reports, all producing multiple children. He made a special mark, premium breeding stock, reserved for the Khan's personal program. The mother who'd tried to hide her daughter under grain sacks learned the futility of resistance. The intelligence network had already reported the girl's existence. When guards dragged her from hiding, the administrator simply checked off another name. Expected merchandise, finally collected. But the worst part was the medical experiments disguised as selection criteria. The Mongol physicians had women drink specific herbs, watching for reactions that indicated fertility. They tested breast tissue response, looking for hormonal indicators. They even examined menstrual blood, having developed crude tests for reproductive health. Medieval science applied to human livestock. The selection process continued for 3 days. Every woman in Nishapur sorted and categorized. The administrators worked in shifts, maintaining the same mechanical efficiency, whether processing their first victim or their 1,000th. The quill scratching never stopped. The platform never emptied. The screaming became background noise. By sunset of the 3rd day, the ledgers contained 3,000 names, 3,000 fates decided, 3,000 futures erased. The administrator closed his book with satisfaction. Nishapur's quota exceeded by 12%. He'd receive a commendation, maybe even first pick from the next city's harvest. The women in holding pens didn't know their categories yet. They'd learn soon enough, when guards came to move them to different wagons, when their rations differed, when their treatment revealed their ranking in this hierarchy of horror. For now, they simply held each other and waited. The platform stood empty as night fell. Tomorrow it would be dismantled, loaded onto wagons, carried to the next city. The same scene would replay, the same sorting, the same reduction of humans to breeding categories. The machinery of selection, portable and efficient. But selection was just the beginning. Being chosen didn't mean simply being taken. The Mongols had learned that breaking a woman's body was easy. Breaking her identity took planning. The psychological system they developed started with the one thing no one could take: their names. The woman stared at the Mongol administrator, her mouth moving soundlessly. She knew he'd asked her name. She knew she should answer. But the word that had defined her for 23 years simply wouldn't come. Behind her, other women lined up for morning roll call. The scratching of quills on parchment mixed with whispered numbers. 1, 2, 3. The guards counted them like sacks of grain, and that's when it hit her. She couldn't remember what her mother had called her. 6 months. 6 months since the day they dragged her from her home in Samarkand. 6 months of being called only 27, her processing number tattooed in blue ink on her inner wrist. The number they shouted when her turn came. The number they recorded in ledgers after each violation, the only identity that mattered anymore. The administrator's patience wore thin. He barked something in Mongolian, and a guard stepped forward with a leather strap. But even the threat of beating couldn't summon what no longer existed. The woman who'd once been someone's daughter, someone's pride, opened her mouth and croaked out the only truth left. 27. Here's where the psychological system reveals its calculated cruelty. The Mongols hadn't stumbled onto name erasure by accident. They'd perfected it through methodical experimentation across hundreds of conquered cities. The process started immediately at capture. Guards stripped women of everything: clothing, jewelry, religious items. But those could be replaced. Names couldn't. From their first moment in captivity, women heard only numbers. The girl who'd spent 16 years as Mariam became 412. The mother of 3 who'd built her identity around being Nasrin turned into 91. The ledgers from Bukhara show the progression. Week 1. Subjects respond to numbers with resistance. Week 4. Confusion when birth names are used. Week 12. Complete disassociation. Week 24. Subjects cannot recall original identities without prompting. The administrators tracked this dissolution like merchants tracking spoilage rates. But numbers were just the beginning. The Mongols assigned functional names based on breeding categories. Breeder Khan third rank, infantry general use, officer premium stock. These weren't names but job descriptions, branded into consciousness through endless repetition. The woman who'd forgotten her name wasn't alone in the morning lineup. Beside her stood a 15-year-old who flinched whenever someone said daughter, the word her category name contained. Behind them, a woman who'd been a scholar now answered only to Scribe Breed 7, assigned to produce literate offspring for the administrative corps. The scratching of quills recorded their transformed identities. Where Persian scribes had once written marriage contracts with elaborate names full of lineage and honor, Mongol administrators reduced existence to breeding function. The linguistic genocide was as thorough as the physical one. They enforced the system through calculated punishment. A woman caught whispering her real name faced 3 days without water. Caught twice? They'd burn her number deeper, scarring over the first tattoo. The pain would forever link identity with suffering. But here's the truly diabolical part. They made the women enforce it on each other. New captives who used birth names were punished collectively. The entire wagon would lose rations until the offender learned. Within weeks, traumatized women policed each other's language more harshly than any guard. The morning roll call continued. 43, a hand raised. 97, another response. Each number called stripped away another layer of personhood. Some women moved their lips, trying to remember prayers that required speaking their own names to God. But which name? The one they couldn't remember, or the number burned into their skin? Native languages died next. The administrators had learned that women resisting in Persian or Arabic maintained cultural identity, so they banned everything but basic Mongolian commands. Women caught speaking, their birth tongues faced the punishment wagons. After months of silence, many forgot the words for concepts like dignity or freedom or hope. The prohibition extended to songs, stories, even lullabies. A mother humming a Turkish cradle song to her infant would have the baby removed immediately. The message was clear. Your culture ends here. Your language ends here. You end here. The guards understood enough Persian to catch violations, but they pretended otherwise. It was another psychological weapon. Women would whisper urgently to each other, not knowing a guard 3 feet away understood every word. The paranoia of never knowing who listened, who reported, who could be trusted. Some women tried to preserve their identities through hidden objects. A strand of hair from a daughter, a pebble from home, prayer beads sewn into hems. When guards found these talismans, the punishment wasn't just confiscation. They'd force the woman to destroy it herself. Burn the hair, crush the stone, break the beads. Complicity in erasing their own past. The children born into the system never learned their mother's true names. They grew up knowing only numbers and breeding categories. My mother is breeder 421 became a complete identity. The linguistic chains passed to the next generation before they could speak. But the most insidious element was the reward system. Women who fully embraced their numbers received extra food. Those who helped rename new captives gained privileges. The fastest path to survival was complete surrender of self. Many women made that calculation and paid with their souls. The Mongol linguists, ES, because that's what they were, specialists in destroying language, documented their methods with academic precision. They noted which naming systems broke down fastest. Religious names held longest. Nicknames disappeared first. Names with family meaning created most resistance. All data points for refining their system. A pregnant woman in the line suddenly spoke. "My name, Island." She paused, face contorting with effort. The words came out wrong. Half remembered. "My name was." Another pause. Was. Past tense. Even grammar bent to acknowledge the death of who she'd been. The administrator made a note. Subject showing standard identity dissolution for 6th month captivity. Proceeding normally. No intervention required. His quill moved to the next entry without pause. The sound of weeping drifted from the newest arrivals area. Fresh captives who still knew their names still cried them out for mothers who'd never answer. Give them time, the veterans thought. Time and the systematic grinding away of self that came with each roll call. Each number shouted, each moment of being less than livestock because at least animals kept their sounds. The woman who'd forgotten her name shuffled forward as the line moved. Behind her, someone whispered urgently in Arabic. A new girl, maybe 3 days in captivity, trying desperately to remind others of their names. "You're Aisha. Remember? Aisha from the mosque school. And you're Zara." The veterans turned away. They'd seen this before. Hope dressed as memory, trying to resurrect the dead. By next week, the new girl would whisper numbers instead. By next month, she'd report others for using birth names. The system never failed. The administrators had calculated everything. They knew it took 4 months to break most names, 6 months to erase language patterns, 8 months to create women who genuinely couldn't remember being anything but numbered breeding stock. They'd turned identity destruction into a science measured in months and tears. But one woman in line still fought. Every morning for 6 months, she'd silently recited her full name, her father's name, her grandfather's name, a genealogy of resistance spoken only in her mind where guards couldn't punish. Today, like every day, she began, "I am Mariam, daughter of, daughter of, daughter of." The name wouldn't come. Her father's face blurred with a guard's. Her grandfather's voice mixed with Mongolian commands. The mental fortress she'd built crumbled in that moment of silence. Even in the sanctuary of her own mind, the numbers had won. The administrator finished roll call and closed his ledger. 312 units accounted for, 17 new arrivals to process, 4 transfers to other facilities. The morning's work complete. He never noticed the woman in line who'd just lost her last battle, who stood swaying as the final piece of her former self dissolved. The named became the numbered became functions. Functions became flesh to be used and discarded. The psychological architecture of turning humans into breeding machines, built on the grave of language itself. But breaking minds was one thing. The Mongols wanted to engineer bodies. The medical experiments they conducted in the name of optimizing fertility would turn healers into monsters and transform pregnancy from hope into horror. The Imperial Physician's Journal survived, and his clinical notes about optimizing female breeding capacity read like a medieval horror story. The leather-bound volume sits in a Moscow archive, pages yellowed with age and something darker. When researchers finally gained permission to translate it in 2004, they needed counseling afterward. Not because of the medical procedures described, because of the matter-of-fact tone used to document them. The first entry dates from 1221, written in the precise hand of someone who considered himself a scientist. Subject 432 presents irregular bleeding. Applied mercury compounds to regulate fertility cycle. Subject experienced expected convulsions. Resumed normal menstruation within 7 days. Pregnancy achieved within 2 months. Success. The scratching of his reed pen fills the medical tent. Around him, women lie on rough tables, their bodies subjected to experiments that would constitute war crimes by any modern standard. But to him, they're not patients. They're breeding stock requiring optimization. Here's what makes this systematic. The physician wasn't some rogue sadist. He was part of an empire-wide medical corps trained specifically for reproductive management. They shared findings through quarterly reports. They competed for best pregnancy rates. They refined techniques based on thousands of test subjects who couldn't refuse. The journal's next entry reveals the herbs they forced women to consume. Black cohosh to trigger ovulation. Pomegranate seeds to thicken uterine walls. Mercury to purify the womb. A treatment that caused kidney failure in countless victims. The physician noted side effects with the same detachment he'd use for horse breeding. Vomiting, hair loss, tooth decay, acceptable losses for increased fertility. But the experiments went beyond herbal treatments. A 16-year-old girl screams as the physician inserts bronze instruments to assess cervical readiness. He notes her virgin status made examination difficult but necessary. Young breeders needed preparation for repeated use. His solution involved gradual dilation using carved jade implements, a process that took weeks and left many unable to walk. The sound of grinding herbs mixes with muffled sobs. Two assistants prepare the daily fertility drafts, different mixtures for different categories. New captives received purgatives to cleanse previous contamination. Pregnant women got strengthening tonics that caused violent cramping, but supposedly prevented miscarriage. Women who'd failed to conceive faced the harshest treatments. The physician's notes on these barren cases reveal the depths of medical cruelty. Insertion of irritants to stimulate the womb, burning of specific pressure points, force-feeding of animal organs believed to transfer fertility. When none of these worked, surgical intervention. The survival rates for these procedures weren't recorded. Only the successes mattered. Here's where the systematic nature becomes undeniable. The physicians tracked menstrual cycles with astronomical precision. They'd developed a lunar calendar specifically for breeding management. Each woman's cycle was recorded, predicted, optimized. Guards received schedules indicating peak fertility windows. Rape wasn't random. It was timed for maximum conception probability. The journal contains detailed drawings, not of human anatomy, the physicians knew that well enough, but of restraint systems designed for medical procedures, how to position a woman for forced examination, which pressure points prevented resistance without damaging reproductive organs, illustrated guides to breaking the human body while keeping it functional. A new sound cuts through the medical tent. Retching. The morning's fertility draft taking effect. 12 women lined up for their daily dose. A black liquid that burned going down and left them dizzy for hours. But it worked. Pregnancy rates in treated populations exceeded 70%. The physician noted this with pride. The experiments included dietary control measured down to the grain. Pregnant women received specific rations. Extra lamb fat for fetal development. Ground bones for calcium. Fermented mare's milk for strength. The amounts calculated based on body weight and pregnancy stage. Too little, and babies came out weak. Too much, and women grew strong enough to resist. Non-pregnant women faced systematic starvation interrupted by strategic feeding. The physicians had discovered that malnutrition stopped menstruation, but carefully timed refeeding triggered superovulation. Multiple eggs released at once. Higher chances of conception. Higher chances of twins. The calendars in the journal show feeding schedules designed to manipulate biology itself. But wait, the documents reveal something worse. The physician wasn't just treating individuals, he was conducting population-level experiments. Different ethnic groups received different treatments. He'd noticed Central Asian women responded better to certain herbs. Chinese captives needed different dosages. Persian women showed resistance to standard treatments. All documented with the thoroughness of modern pharmaceutical trials, but none of the ethics. A woman writhing on the examination table catches his attention. Subject 9, 17, 4 months pregnant, showing signs of distress. The physician palpates her stomach with practiced hands, feeling for fetal position. His notes indicate concern, breech presentation, high risk of stillbirth, unacceptable loss of investment. What happens next appears in the journal as a routine procedure. Manual version of the fetus, without anesthesia, without consent. The woman's screams mean nothing compared to protecting the empire's genetic investment. The physician works for 20 minutes, hands inside her, turning the baby. His notes express satisfaction when he feels the head descend. Crisis averted. Breeding stock preserved. The medical tent operates on strict schedules. Dawn. Fertility drafts administered. Morning. Examinations of new captives. Midday. Pregnancy confirmations. Afternoon. Treatment of complications. Evening. Surgical procedures on the difficult cases. Night. Documentation and correspondence with other medical units. The correspondence reveals a network of physicians sharing discoveries. One in Samarkand found that rosehip tea increased milk production. Another in Baghdad developed a salve for healing birth trauma faster, returning women to breeding rotation sooner. They traded recipes like merchants trading spices, each formula representing suffering distilled to its useful components. The physician's pride shows in entries about his innovations. He'd developed a pregnancy test using wheat grains and urine, achieving 60% accuracy. He'd created a fertility prediction system based on hip measurements and family history. He'd even found ways to influence gender selection, though his success rates remained frustratingly low. But the true horror lies in the disposal protocols. Women who couldn't conceive after 6 months of treatment faced termination of breeding status. The journal doesn't detail what happened next, but archaeological evidence fills the gaps. Mass graves near medical facilities, remains showing evidence of vivisection. The physicians hadn't just discarded failed breeders, they'd used them for anatomical study, advancing their understanding through dissection of women they'd destroyed. The sound of bronze instruments being cleaned rings through the tent, blood and other fluids washed away, tools prepared for the next patient, the next experiment, the next attempt to turn female bodies into more efficient factories of genetic conquest. A 13-year-old girl enters for her first examination. The physician notes her terror with clinical interest. Fear responses might affect fertility. He prescribes a calming draft, not mercy, just biological optimization. Her terror might reduce conception rates, and the empire couldn't afford inefficiency. The journal's final entries from 1223 show the system at its peak. Pregnancy rates approaching 80%, infant mortality down to 15%. Successful breeding cycles reduced from 18 months to 14. The physician expressed hope that further refinements could achieve 12-month cycles, matching the efficiency of livestock operations. But efficiency came at a cost measured in more than lives. The women subjected to these experiments didn't just suffer physically. The combination of drugs, starvation, forced pregnancy, and surgical intervention created a specific type of madness. The physicians documented it without understanding, subjects becoming disconnected from reality, women who ceased responding to stimuli. What we'd now recognize as severe dissociative disorders brought on by medical torture. The physician never saw it as torture. His journal entries maintain the tone of scientific inquiry throughout. Each woman reduced to data points. Each pregnancy a successful experiment. Each death a learning opportunity for refining the system. The banality of evil, dressed in medical terminology. The medical system produced results, though. Thousands of pregnancies, tens of thousands of babies, living evidence of an empire that had weaponized women's bodies with scientific precision. And those children became currency. The Mongol reward economy turned newborns into paychecks for the soldiers who'd created them. Coins clinked in a palm, horses snorted in their tethers, and campfire wood popped. The soldier counted his bonus aloud, almost singing. 3 gold pieces, 2 horses. First pick from the next shipment of captured women, all for taking one strategic hill. His breath fogged in the cold as if that list were just another kit check, not a currency of human lives. Quills scratched in the command tent, while the paymaster read from a board of slats. The ledgers actually show a reward schedule that matched kill reports to payouts and to access tiers. Breach a gate, earn extra rations, and a higher draft order. Hold a bridge, get first entry into officer tier selection. The paper trail pinned horror to an exchange rate. Leather creaked as the pay chest opened. Metal rang, and then the administrators recorded something that makes my stomach turn. Women allocated as pay supplements, not loot, not chaos. Structured distribution that slotted bodies into ranks with the same neatness as arrows into a quiver. Murmurs swelled just outside the tent. Soldiers traded their vouchers like gamblers after a dice throw. A man rubbed a wooden token between finger and thumb. He wanted to swap one lower tier selection for a share of a mare and a place in a later, better queue. The pay clerk nodded, took his token, and made a note. The trade sounded normal in the buzz of a busy evening, a small deal in the hum of a market. Except the goods waited behind canvas, breathing. Here's where it gets systematic. The reward tables used categories we have already seen in the processing ledgers. Officer premium, general use, punishment stock. The pay office translated those into prices. A cut of silver for a lower category, a horse or a commendation for a higher. Access quality rose with rank. Men killed harder for better selections. You can hear it in the bragging from campaign journals. A cavalryman wrote, "I earned my way to the front of the line," and he underlined, "earned" twice. Hoofbeats thudded past while a runner delivered the weekly returns. The scroll crackled when the paymaster broke the seal. The tally matched captured districts to quarterly quotas and showed a new column labeled morale disbursements. That was the phrase for distributing women as bonuses to keep units from desertion. The ledgers actually show that word, morale, as if they tracked smiles and not screams. Out by the picket lines, men haggled in low voices. A belt buckle scraped stone. Someone whispered, "Trade you my second pick for your 2 lower ones and a saddle." Barter grew around the system like mold around damp bread. The administrators didn't stop it. They regulated it. Scribes noted swaps, so no unit could claim the same body twice. The lattice of cruelty held firm, even when men treated lives like poker chips. Bootsteps crunched as a captain pushed into the tent. He slapped down a tooth-stained ribbon snatched from a ruined standard and grinned. The paymaster slid a slate across to him. Bonus. Approved. First access to officer premium stock. A single mark beside his name changed 3 futures in a pen outside. The man laughed through his nose. The room went colder. And then the administrators recorded inflation. Shortages after hard sieges drove prices up in the next cycle. The tables show category values rising by 1/3 when caravans arrived thin. Scarcity made women more expensive, and men cheered when commanders promised fresh supply. That sentence writes itself like a curse. Scarcity, expensive, fresh. Wagon wheels rolled, heavy with the pay itself. Not coined. Assignments. A courier rattled past the cook fires with a chest of stamped wooden chips, each carved with a symbol for a category and a number that matched a man's claim. The sound of those chips knocking together inside the chest made a dry rattle like bones. You feel it in your teeth. But wait. The documents reveal something worse. Commanders converted births into reward points. A unit credited with more pregnancies recorded in a quarter received extra fodder, better winter quarters, early leaves. The fathers didn't need to prove paternity. The system paid the unit for production. Babies tallied as bonuses. A newborn's first cry cashed out as logistics. Silence pooled, thick. After that line, the tent seemed to hold its breath. A scribe read aloud from an allocation list so there could be no dispute later. Herat Garrison, 2 officer premium, 4 general use. Bukhara Cavalry, 1 officer premium, 6 general use. 1 punishment stock for discipline rotation. He didn't stutter. He sounded like a clerk assigning hay to stables. A mule brayed in the dark, then fell quiet. I can hear pages flipping. The administrators built distribution networks that stretched from central posts to the far edges of advance. They shipped morale disbursements with forage and nails. They tracked receipts signed by captains with a pressed thumb. They penalized units that misapplied their allocations by dumping lower-tier women on higher-tier men. The cruelty policed itself. Men competed for better placements in the queue. A runner panted in with a dispatch, naming those who breached first, who held longest, who rode farthest. The first names in the list strolled through a separate tent flap, while others stared, fists clenched. Competition sharpened violence. Every assault stacked another step on a ladder toward first pick. Micro cliffhanger. A single line buried near the bottom of 1 quarter's accounts breaks me. 2 girls assigned as settlement gifts to allied chieftains. The sound of a wax seal snapping rose over the murmurs. Diplomatic pay. Women as letters of credit. The ledgers actually show ratio adjustments by season. Winter campaigns paid in fuel and access. Summer campaigns paid in horses and access. Access stayed constant. The currency of bodies crossed seasons, borders, and languages without losing value because the system defined value. On the far side of camp, a child cried once, sudden and short, then nothing. The paymaster kept reading. The documents note disciplinary deductions for men who disobeyed rotation orders. That phrase hides the punishment wagons in daylight. Even pay revolved around the schedule of use. Here's where the numbers turn to ash in the mouth. Administrators tied food bonuses for officers to pregnancy counts among their assigned stock. You hear it in the casual way a captain said to his second, voice low under tent canvas, "Keep them fed until they quicken, then shave rations." The second grunted. Quill scratched. Policy became practice in a breath. Wind tugged at a tent rope and made it hum. In a later phase, shortages spiked again and the tables rose. Men traded their gold for earlier access. Horses went for a single token carved with the symbol for the top category. Inflation didn't distort the system. Inflation proved how central it had become. The economy of rape ran parallel to coin and fodder, and won. And then the administrators recorded the dirtiest conversion rate. They tracked the effect of morale disbursements on unit performance. They measured fewer desertions, faster sieges, cleaner supply lines. The reward economy didn't sit at the margins. It drove conquest forward like a spur in a horse's flank. Micro cliffhanger. A journal from an archer ends with a line that lands like a hammer. We took the hill. They paid us well. I will ride again. Paper can't hold a scream, but I swear I hear one between those words. Campfire pops softened. Coins stopped ringing. The pay chest closed with a wooden thud that echoed too long. The system logged its last entry for the day. Bonuses issued. Access assigned. Trades recorded. Production credited. Every sound in that tent told me the same truth. This economy devoured women and spit out victories. But what happened when women couldn't produce? The disposal methods reveal the ultimate dehumanization. The ink dries. The wind falls still. A spade bites earth. The administrative note was just 7 words. Baron, after 6 attempts, approved for disposal. The quill scratched those words onto parchment, like a death sentence written in accounting language. Behind the scribe, wagon wheels creaked under loads they weren't meant to carry. Not grain, not weapons. Women who'd failed their only purpose in this system. Here's where the disposal methods reveal something that makes modern human trafficking look almost merciful. The Mongols didn't just discard failed breeders. They'd created an entire secondary economy around women whose bodies wouldn't cooperate with empire building. The sorting happened at dawn. Guards pushed women into 3 lines while administrators checked their ledgers. First line, those who'd miscarried too many times. Second line, those who'd never conceived despite months of systematic rape. Third line, those whose babies died at birth. Each line led to a different wagon. Each wagon rolled toward a different kind of hell. A woman in the first line clutched her stomach, remembering the 6 pregnancies that ended in blood and screaming. The administrator glanced at her processing number 247 and made a note. Habitual miscarriage. Organs likely damaged, suitable for medical study. The scratch of his quill sealed her fate more finely than any executioner's blade. The sound of coins exchanging hands drifted from behind the administrative tent. Slave traders had arrived before sunrise, their purses heavy with silver. They knew the schedule. Every 3 months, the breeding facilities held disposal auctions. Women who couldn't produce sons for the empire could still produce profit for merchants. But the Mongols had standards even for their discards. The traders examined women like livestock, which is exactly what they'd become. Teeth checked for age, hands examined for work capability, scars catalogued to assess remaining use value. Those who passed inspection would spend their remaining years in mines, fields or brothels from Damascus to Delhi. Those who didn't. The mass grave outside Merv tells that story. Archaeologists found the remains of 300 women, all showing signs of malnutrition and repeated trauma, all buried in the same week. The precision of the grave placement bodies arranged in neat rows, sorted by approximate age, reveals the same administrative efficiency that characterized every aspect of the system. Here's what made it systematic. The disposal wasn't random or rage-driven. The administrators had calculated exact percentages. Keep the failure rate too low, and you'd waste resources on women who'd never conceive. Too high, and you'd discard potentially productive stock. They'd settled on 6 attempts, 6 violations, 6 chances to fulfill their purpose. Then disposal. A woman in the second line started singing, a Persian lullaby, soft and broken. She'd never held a baby, never felt life quicken inside her despite 2 years in the breeding wagons. The other women took up the song, voices mixing in the dawn air. The guards didn't stop them. These women were already dead to the system. Their voices meant nothing. The third line moved fastest. Women who'd birthed dead babies or those too weak to survive. The administrators considered them the most dangerous category. Something in them killed Mongol seed. They might spread their deficiency to others. Quick disposal was essential. The sorting clerk called out destinations with the same tone he'd use for grain distribution. Lots 1 through 50, Khwarezm slave markets. Lots 51 through 100, medical facility, Samarkand. Lots 100 to 1 through 150, immediate termination. The medical facility. Those words made even hardened women shudder. They'd heard whispers from guards about what happened there. The physicians who'd failed to make them fertile would use their bodies one last time, not for breeding, for understanding, vivisection without anesthesia, organ study while hearts still beat. The advance of medical knowledge paid for in screams that lasted days. But wait, the ledgers reveal something even worse about the disposal system. Some women weren't discarded for failing to breed. They were disposed of for succeeding too well. The genetic sorting process had dark efficiency. Women who birthed too many daughters faced elimination. Those whose sons showed defects, club feet, hair ellipse, mental slowness, disappeared, along with their offspring. The empire wanted specific genetic outcomes. Deviation meant death. A cart rolled past loaded with small bodies. The morning sort of defective infants. Mothers in the disposal lines who recognized tiny limbs, a familiar birthmark, a wisp of hair, threw themselves toward the cart. Guards beat them back with practiced efficiency. No disruptions allowed during processing. The punishment wagon women faced the worst fate. These were the ones who'd fought hardest, who'd killed guards, who'd tried to poison pregnant women to spare them, who'd strangled their own babies rather than let them enter the system. The administrators had special plans for them. The documents use the term public example. Archaeological evidence fills in the details. Stakes driven into ground. Bodies positioned to be visible from the breeding wagons. Death taking days while other women were forced to watch. The message clear. Resist and this is your future. Submit and you might survive long enough for disposal by other means. Here's where the numbers tell their own horror story. The administrators tracked disposal rates with the same precision as breeding rates. 12% quarterly average. That meant for every 100 women entering the system, 12 would be dead or sold within 3 months. Acceptable losses. Calculated attrition. The cost of genetic conquest. The disposal economy had its own hierarchies. Young women who'd failed to conceive might bring good prices at slave markets. They had years of labor left. Older women, or those damaged by multiple pregnancies, brought less. The very damaged, those driven mad by the system, bodies broken beyond use-cost money to dispose of. Mass graves required diggers. Burning required fuel. Even death had its price point. The morning mist lifted as the last women were loaded. Different wagons rolling different directions. Some toward slave markets where they'd be raped by new masters for profit instead of breeding. Some toward medical facilities for a different kind of violation. Some toward pre-dug pits where efficient death awaited. The woman who'd sung the lullaby found herself in a wagon bound for the Khwarezm markets. As wheels began to roll, she looked back at the breeding facility that had been her prison for 2 years. Other women pressed against wagon bars, watching her leave. In their eyes, she saw something worse than envy. Relief. Relief that disposal by sale was better than disposal by stake or scalpel. The administrators finished their morning work and began preparing for the next shipment. Fresh women arriving from the latest conquest. The disposal wagons had made room. The cycle would continue. Process, breed, dispose, replace. The machinery of genetic imperialism grinding on. But the true horror wasn't just in the disposal itself. It was in the warning it provided to women still in the system. Every 3 months, they watched the sorting. Every 3 months, they counted who disappeared. Every 3 months, they wondered if their own bodies would betray them into those lines. The disposal system created its own psychological torture. Women forced to celebrate pregnancy not from maternal joy but from survival instinct. Each successful birth bought more time. Each miscarriage brought them closer to dawn sorting and wagon wheels rolling toward darkness. The guards burned the morning's documentation as per protocol. No permanent records of individual disposals. just quarterly statistics rolled into breeding efficiency reports. The women who'd failed to produce more Mongols erased from history as thoroughly as their names had been erased from their memories. But efficiency demanded replacement. Empty spaces in breeding wagons needed filling. The system required fresh wombs to maintain quotas. And so the disposal methods connected to the selection process in an endless cycle. Sort, breed, dispose, replace. The arithmetic of atrocity. The screaming from the medical wagons faded as they rolled towards Samarkand. The slave market wagons kicked up dust heading west. The termination groups marched toward pre-selected sites. By noon, all evidence of the morning sort would be gone except for fresh spaces in the breeding barracks and updated numbers in ledgers. Those who produced children faced a different horror, watching their babies sorted like livestock. The fate of mixed-blood children depended on the shape of their eyes, the curve of their skulls, the width of their cheekbones, physical features that would determine whether they lived as Mongol warriors or died as genetic failures. The twins were born minutes apart, but their futures split forever when the inspector declared one Mongol enough and the other too Persian. The morning sun cast shadows through tent flaps as the administrative clerk bent over two infants. His practiced hands turned small heads, measuring skull width with calipers. The scratching of his quill on parchment mixed with the exhausted breathing of their mother, still bleeding from the birth. Male one, epicanthic fold present, cheekbones prominent, suitable for military cohort. His voice carried the same enthusiasm as someone sorting wheat from chaff. Male 2, eyes too round, nose too narrow. Facial structure indicates Persian dominance. Disposal recommended. The mother's scream cut through the medical tent like a blade. She'd understood enough Mongolian to know her second son had just been sentenced to death for the shape of his eyes. Here's where the genetic sorting reveals its calculated cruelty. The Mongols didn't just breed children. They sorted them like livestock, keeping only those who looked sufficiently Mongol to strengthen their bloodlines. The inspection process started within hours of birth. Teams of assessors trained to identify racial characteristics moved through the birthing tents with mechanical efficiency. Width of face, shape of eyes, color of skin, texture of hair once it grew. Each feature catalogued, scored, and judged against standards set by administrators who'd turned eugenics into imperial policy. A wet nurse in the corner tried to shield the baby in her arms from the inspector's gaze. Too late. He'd already noticed the child's delicate features, the Persian curve of her lips. His ledger notation took 3 seconds. Another life decided by bone structure. The sound of infants crying filled the morning air, but not all cries were equal. Those marked acceptable were bundled in wool and taken to nursing tents. Those marked inferior disappeared into smaller wagons with barred windows. The mothers never asked where those wagons went. The silence from that direction told them enough. But the sorting went beyond simple appearance. The assessors tracked behavioral traits they believed were genetic. Did the baby cry too much? Persian weakness. Did it feed aggressively? Mongol strength. Did it sleep soundly through chaos? Good warrior material. Did it startle at loud noises? Defective bloodline. The administrative efficiency of child sorting matched everything else in the system. Each baby received a number within minutes of birth. M for Mongol acceptable, P for Persian dominant, C for Chinese features, T for Turkish. The letters became destinies before the infants could even focus their eyes. A 3-year-old boy stood before another inspector, trembling as strange hands measured his limbs. He'd survived the initial sorting, but secondary assessments happened yearly. Children who'd looked Mongol enough as infants might develop wrong as they grew. Persian features emerging with age meant reclassification. Reclassification meant separation. The boy's mother watched from behind a guard, her hands pressed against her mouth to stop herself from calling out. She'd learned that showing emotion during inspections led to automatic failure. Maternal attachment indicated weak bloodlines, so she stood silent as they declared her son's eyes had grown too large, too expressive, too Persian. Here's what made this systematic horror complete. The Mongols kept detailed records of which pairings produced which types of children. A Mongol officer who consistently fathered Persian-looking offspring faced reassignment. A captured woman who bore only inferior children faced disposal. The genetics of rape tracked with accounting precision. The separation scenes haunt the archaeological record. Mass graves of children aged 2 to 5, all showing similar defective characteristics. Smaller bones indicating Chinese build. Skull shapes suggesting Persian ancestry, the empire's genetic waste, buried in orderly rows. But some children occupied a middle category that revealed even darker purposes. Those who looked Mongol enough to keep, but showed intelligence markers associated with conquered peoples. These became the translator children, the scribe children, the administrative children, raised to serve the empire that murdered their siblings for wrong-shaped eyes. A 5-year-old girl stood perfectly still as an administrator tested her memory. She'd already learned basic Mongolian, could count to 100, showed aptitude for written symbols. Her features sat exactly between Mongol and Persian, making her ideal for diplomatic training. She'd grow up serving the empire that had rated her mother as breeding stock and killed her brother for a narrow nose. The sound of wooden wheels on stone marked another collection round. Guards moved through the children's area, gathering those marked for redistribution. Mongol-acceptable boys headed to military training camps where they'd learn to rape and pillage like their fathers. Mongol-acceptable girls went to holding facilities where they'd wait until old enough to become breeding stock themselves. The rejected children's fate depended on age and assessment scores. Infants disappeared quickly. Toddlers who showed skills might become slaves. Older children faced labor camps or worse. The precision of sorting extended to disposal methods. Each category of genetic failure assigned its specific end. But the administrators tracked more than just physical features. They'd noticed patterns in conception timing, birth seasons, maternal age. Children conceived during certain months showed higher rates of acceptable features. Women bred too young produced more defective offspring. Those bred too old birthed weaklings. The data accumulated into breeding calendars that maximized desired genetic outcomes. A Mongol officer strode through the nursery tent, selecting his offspring from the previous year's campaigns. The administrator pointed out 3 boys bearing his coded mark. The officer examined each like horses at market, checking teeth, testing reflexes, observing temperament. He chose 2. The third, despite looking sufficiently Mongol, cried too easily. Weak bloodline expression. Back to the disposal queue. The mothers weren't allowed to name their children. Names implied permanence, and nothing about these infants' futures was guaranteed. They were called by numbers until genetic sorting determined their fate. Only Mongol-accepted children eventually received names, usually at military or administrative facilities far from their mothers. Here's where the horror becomes statistical. The ledgers from one facility show sorting outcomes over 5 years. Of 10,000 births, 6,000 passed initial inspection. Of those 6,000, 4,000 survived to age 5. Of those 4,000, 2,500 made it to adulthood. The genetic funnel of empire, measured in small bodies and mass graves. The inspection standards grew more refined over time. Early sorting focused on obvious features. Later assessments included gait patterns, voice pitch, even sleep positions believed to indicate racial characteristics. The pseudoscience of genetic purity practiced on infants who couldn't yet walk. A pregnant woman in the corner watched the morning's sorting, her hands protective over her swollen belly. She'd already birthed 2 children, both taken. Both failed genetic assessment. She knew her third chance was her last. The administrators had made that clear. 3 strikes and disposal. Her body shook with the knowledge that her baby's eye shape would determine both their fates. The efficiency extended to milk distribution. Mongol-acceptable babies got first access to wet nurses. Mixed-feature infants received adequate nutrition. Those marked for disposal got just enough to keep them alive until final processing. Even mother's milk became part of the genetic hierarchy. But the cruelest part wasn't the sorting itself. It was making mothers complicit. Women who showed grief when defective children were taken faced punishment. Those who remained stoic received rewards. The system trained mothers to feel relief when their babies passed inspection, to feel nothing when they failed. Maternal instinct weaponized against itself. The morning sorting finished with mechanical precision. 32 births assessed. 19 passed initial inspection. 13 marked for disposal. The administrator sealed his ledger and moved to the next facility. Tomorrow would bring more births, more measurements, more tiny lives, reduced to genetic potential. The sound of a single baby crying echoed through the tent. A mother tried to muffle the sound, knowing excessive crying meant negative assessment. Her hands shook as she rocked the infant, whispering Mongolian lullabies she'd learned to please the guards. Anything to make her baby seem more Mongol, less Persian, more worthy of life. The twins from the morning's opening were separated within the hour, one bundled in thick wool and carried to the military nursery, where he'd learned to become his father's image. The other, the one with eyes too round and nose too narrow, vanished into a smaller wagon. His mother never saw what happened next. The efficient silence of genetic disposal. But those sorted children grew into adults who carried the evidence in their blood. 8 centuries later, 16 million men walk the earth bearing the genetic markers of this industrial horror. Which brings us back to that mother in 1220, watching her daughter disappear into the system that would multiply her suffering into DNA itself. The ground beneath her feet held bones, not scattered, organized, row after row after row. The archaeological team working outside Merv made the discovery in 1996, but they didn't understand what they'd found until the DNA results came back. 300 women, same time period, same age range, same cause of death, visible in the trauma patterns on their remains. The mother from our opening? They found her, not by name. Those were erased centuries ago. They found her by the small carved bead clutched in her skeletal hand. The kind mothers gave daughters for protection. The kind that didn't work when the ledgers already held your fate. Isotope analysis of her teeth showed she'd grown up eating wheat from Nishapur's fields. Pelvic scarring indicated multiple births. A clean blade mark on her 5th rib showed how her story ended when she couldn't produce anymore. Here's what destroys me. In the same mass grave, they found younger bones. A woman aged 19 to 21. Same isotopes. Same geographic origin, same time of death. The archaeologists ran the mitochondrial DNA twice to be sure, mother and daughter, buried together. Not from mercy, from efficiency. The disposal crews that day had work to finish before sunset. The daughter's remains told their own story. Evidence of at least 5 pregnancies before age 20. Healed fractures suggesting repeated assault. Teeth worn from malnutrition despite carrying multiple children to term. Her breeding record would have filled several ledger pages. All those careful notations about fertility windows and pregnancy outcomes. All those children taken and scattered across an empire. The genetic analysis went deeper. Her mitochondrial lineage appears in populations from Iran to Mongolia today. Not through her sons. Those belonged to the empire. Through daughters who survived, who were bred in turn, who passed on their grandmother's DNA mixed with their rapist's seed. That 14-year-old girl dragged from her home became a genetic ghost haunting millions. But she wasn't unique. The Merv grave held 300 stories. 300 women whose bodies built an empire that outlasted their bones. The archaeologists found evidence of organized burial. Bodies arranged by approximate age. Young women who died in childbirth separated from older ones who'd outlived their usefulness. Even in death, the categorization continued. The local museum displays some artifacts now. The bead that mother clutched, fragments of blue tattoo ink, the processing numbers that marked human cattle, a ledger page, miraculously preserved, showing disposal authorizations. The visitors read about ancient atrocities. They don't realize they might carry the evidence in their cells. Here's where the mathematics of horror becomes personal. 16 million men today carry that Y-chromosome marker, but that's just the male line. The daughters bred and bred and bred. Their DNA spreading through female lines impossible to track. If you have any ancestry from Central Asia to Eastern Europe, chances are you carry genetic evidence of this systematic rape. Your cells remember what history tried to forget. The breeding facilities left their own archaeological signatures. Stone foundations of medical tents, latrine systems, designed for hundreds of women. Mass graves of infants who didn't meet genetic standards. The infrastructure of industrialized rape, written in stone and bone, across half a continent. Modern Mongolians struggle with this legacy. Their greatest historical figure built their nation through the wombs of unwilling women. School textbooks mention conquest, but not the breeding programs. Museums display weapons and artwork, but not the ledgers documenting humans reduced to livestock. The genetic evidence speaks louder than any curator's silence. The Iranian government doesn't publish certain genetic studies. The data showing how thoroughly Mongol DNA penetrated their population. How many of their citizens unknowingly carry markers of 13th century rape? The information exists. Scientists have it. But some truths cut too deep for national pride to bear. In China, the genetic legacy tells different stories. The Yuan dynasty's breeding programs focused on breaking Han bloodlines. They succeeded. Millions of Chinese citizens carry Mongol markers, each one representing a woman whose name was erased, whose culture was violated, whose children were stolen. The one-child policy ironically limited this genetic colonialism's modern spread, but the evidence persists in DNA databases. A lab technician in Beijing processes ancestry tests, finding that marker again and again. She's learned to phrase the results carefully. Genetic diversity from the Yuan period, never mentioning rape, never explaining that diversity meant systematic sexual violence. The customers want to know their heritage. They don't want to know their ancestors' horror. But the living evidence extends beyond individual DNA. Entire populations show the genetic bottlenecks created by Mongol breeding programs. Villages, where 90% of men share Y-chromosome markers. Regions where mitochondrial DNA shows massive female population replacement. The empire didn't just conquer territories. It colonized genomes. The fertility herbs they forced women to consume left traces too. Certain genetic markers for hormone sensitivity appear in populations along Mongol conquest routes. Women today suffering from endometriosis or PCOS might carry susceptibilities bred into their lines by 13th century medical experiments. The physicians who thought they were optimizing fertility created generational suffering. Here's what modern geneticists whisper at conferences but won't publish. The Mongol expansion created more genetic change in Eurasia than 10,000 years of natural selection. One empire, one systematic program, one generation of women turned into factories, the biological equivalent of an atomic bomb, measured in chromosomes instead of radiation. The woman in our opening? Her daughter's breeding ledger survived in fragments. 5 pregnancies between ages 14 and 21. 3 sons who lived past infancy, all taken for military training. 2 daughters sold to secondary breeding facilities. The notations end abruptly in 1226. Disposal authorization. Pregnancy failure after multiple attempts. Her reproductive machinery worn out at 20. Those 3 sons would have trained in Karakoram, learned to ride, learned to kill, learned to rape. By 1240, they'd have been officers leading their own units, collecting their own breeding bonuses, creating their own genetic legacy. The daughter's sons becoming the system that destroyed her. The granddaughters sold to secondary facilities faced their own ledgers, their own processing numbers, their own racial inspections, the system feeding itself through generations. Each woman's suffering multiplied by her daughter's daughter's daughters. The mathematics of inherited trauma calculated in DNA. Today, a young woman in Kazakhstan takes a DNA test and discovers she's related to Genghis Khan. She posts excitedly on social media. Her friends congratulate her on such interesting heritage. No one mentions that her connection comes through an unbroken line of women who were systematically raped. No one calculates how many times her female ancestors were violated to put that marker in her cells. The Mongol Empire fell, but its genetic conquest proved permanent. Political borders shifted, languages evolved, cultures merged and split, but the DNA persisted. Every generation passing on evidence of industrialized rape, every birth certificate potentially documenting 800-year-old crimes. The mass graves tell us how many died. The genetic evidence tells us how many survived. Both numbers stagger comprehension. For every woman buried in organized rows, Dozens lived long enough to birth the empire's future. For every infant disposed of for wrong-shaped eyes, others passed inspection and grew to continue the cycle. But here's the ultimate tragedy. We know more about the men who carried out this system than the women who endured it. We have their names: the generals, the administrators, the physicians. The women remain numbers in ledgers, bones in graves, genetic ghosts in living cells, their individual stories erased as thoroughly as their names. The breeding program succeeded beyond the Mongols' darkest dreams. They wanted to create permanent demographic change. They achieved it. They wanted to colonize through wombs. They did. They wanted their blood to flow through conquered populations forever. 16 million Y-chromosomes prove their success. Modern war crimes tribunals recognize rape as a weapon of war. The Mongols mechanized it. Modern genocides target populations for elimination. The Mongols targeted them for forced reproduction. Modern eugenics programs sterilize the unwanted. The Mongols bred them like cattle and killed the calves that looked wrong. The mother in our opening died, clutching a bead meant to protect her daughter. 8 centuries later, millions carry the proof of that protection's failure in their DNA. Her daughter's name vanished. Her daughter's children scattered. Her daughter's grave unmarked, except by archaeologists who see patterns in bones. But the ledgers survived. The careful notation of human suffering, the bureaucratic precision of genetic warfare, the administrative efficiency of turning rape into reproduction rates. We can read how they did it. We can trace the infrastructure. We can map the genetic spread. We can count the bodies and the births. What we can't do is undo it. The DNA has spread too far. The bloodlines have mixed too thoroughly. The evidence has become us. We are the living monuments to systematic horror. We carry history's largest rape prosecution in our cells. But there's no court for crimes written in chromosomes. The next time someone mentions the Mongol Empire's efficiency, remember what they were efficiently doing. Remember the mother, watching her daughter dragged away. Remember the ledgers already holding her fate. Remember the women reduced to numbers, the babies sorted by skull shape, the wagons rolling toward disposal sites. 16 million men carry that evidence today. But it's the untold millions of women whose names were erased, whose bodies were industrialized, whose children were stolen, who paid the real price of genetic conquest. Their ghosts outnumber the living descendants, and the ledgers, those horrible ledgers, prove it all really happened. The scratching of quills on parchment, the creaking of wagon wheels, the crying of sorted babies, the silence of mass graves, the clinical notation of horror, the mathematical precision of systematic rape, the genetic echo of an empire built on women's wombs. History written in DNA, evidence carried in cells, truth buried in bones but never gone. The administrators closed their ledgers each night and opened them each morning. Just another day's work in humanity's darkest system. Just another quota to fill. Just another generation to breed. Just another empire to build on bodies. The ledgers don't lie. Neither do the bones. Neither do the living. We are all evidence now.